This story begins on December 7th, 1941, in the cold morning twilight of Pearl Harbor. The water burned. Oil-slicked flames rolled across Battleship Row as the pride of America's Pacific Fleet lay shattered and smoking in the harbor's shallow mud. The Arizona had exploded, the Oklahoma capsized, the California settling. In the span of 2 hours, Japanese carrier aircraft had crippled 8 battleships and killed over 2,000 Americans. But as the smoke cleared and rescue crews pulled survivors from the wreckage, something else was missing. 3 ships, the most important ships in the harbor, weren't there. The aircraft carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga had been at sea, and in that absence lay both America's vulnerability and its salvation. 8,000 miles away in Newport News, Virginia, a construction supervisor named Thomas Carroll stood before a massive keel plate on April 28, 1941. The plate weighed 15 tons. It was the foundation for something the world had never seen before. Not in this quantity. Not at this speed. The USS Essex, hull number CV-9, had just begun its journey from blueprint to battle. What no one understood that spring morning, not the welders positioning that first steel plate, not the admirals reviewing the blueprints in Washington, not even the Japanese pilots who would attack Pearl Harbor 7 months later, was that this single ship represented the opening move in the greatest industrial chess match in history. Japan had just committed to a war of quality. America was about to respond with quantity beyond imagination. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of the Pacific War were brutal and simple. Japan entered World War II with 10 battleships, vessels built over decades of careful planning and immense national treasure. The two newest, Yamato and Musashi, were the largest warships ever constructed, 72,000 tons each, armed with 18.1-inch guns that could fire 3,200-pound shells over 26 miles. These steel monsters embodied Japan's strategic philosophy: fight a single decisive battle with overwhelmingly superior individual ships to overcome America's industrial advantage. The Japanese knew they couldn't outbuild America. The United States possessed 32% of worldwide industrial production, compared to Japan's 3.5%. So instead, Japan would build the finest individual warships the world had ever seen: quality over quantity, superior engineering over mass production, the samurai sword versus the factory assembly line. But by the time Yamato was commissioned on December 16, 1941, just 9 days after Pearl Harbor, the war had already shifted beneath Japan's feet. The attack on Pearl Harbor had accomplished its tactical goal, destroying the battle line of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. But it had also revealed something far more important. The 3 American carriers that escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor represented a new kind of warfare, one where battles would be decided not by the range of 16 or 18-inch guns, but by the reach of carrier-based aircraft. And America had already begun building not 1 or 2 supercarriers to match Japan's philosophy. It had begun building an entire fleet of them. 24 Essex-class carriers would be laid down between 1941 and 1945. Not the biggest, not the most powerful individually, but fast enough, tough enough, and numerous enough to be everywhere at once. The Essex-class design had been conceived in 1939, when the Washington Naval Treaty restrictions finally expired and American naval architects could design without artificial limits. The question before them wasn't how to build the biggest carrier, but how to build the right carrier, a carrier that could launch massive airstrikes, a carrier that could absorb damage and survive, a carrier that could be built quickly and in large numbers. The specifications were ambitious: 27,100 tons standard displacement, 60 feet longer than the preceding Yorktown class, nearly 10 feet wider. A flight deck over 800 feet long, capable of operating 90 to 100 aircraft, 4 squadrons of 18 planes each, plus reserves. But most revolutionary was the speed of construction. Traditional naval thinking held that capital ships required 3 to 4 years from keel laying to commissioning. The pre-war carriers Yorktown and Enterprise had taken that long, but the Essex-class would shatter that timeline. The design incorporated flat steel surfaces and standardized components that made construction faster. Modular sections could be built simultaneously in different parts of the shipyard, then assembled like pieces of a massive puzzle. Newport News Shipbuilding became the lead yard, awarded contracts for 7 carriers. The Brooklyn Navy Yard, Norfolk Navy Yard, Philadelphia Navy Yard, and Bethlehem Steel's Fall River facility in Quincy, Massachusetts, would build the rest. All were East Coast yards, positioned to send completed carriers directly into either the Atlantic or Pacific theaters. The first Essex-class keel, CV-9 herself, was laid in April 1941. By December 7th, when Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, 5 Essex-class carriers were already under construction. Within hours of the attack, President Franklin Roosevelt and Navy Secretary Frank Knox made a decision that would reshape the entire war. The Essex-class building contracts were reworked. Construction was accelerated. Every resource, every priority, every bottleneck was cleared. What happened next defied every assumption about shipbuilding. USS Essex was launched on July 31, 1942, just 15 months after her keel was laid. She was commissioned on December 31, 1942, 20 months from keel to combat readiness, half the time of pre-war carriers. And she was just the beginning. The yards learned with each hull. USS Yorktown, CV-10, took 16.5 months from keel to commission. USS Franklin, CV-13, built at Newport News, set the record at just 14 months. 14 months from empty dry dock to fully operational 30,000-ton aircraft carrier capable of launching 100 combat aircraft. The production line didn't stop. It accelerated. By August 1943, Essex and Yorktown arrived in Hawaii, the first of the new generation. A month later, Lexington, replacing the carrier lost at Coral Sea, then Bunker Hill, then Intrepid. Through 1943 and 1944, every 2 months on average, another Essex-class carrier entered service. The conveyor belt of American industrial might was now producing floating cities faster than Japan could replace the carriers it had already lost. The yards themselves had become factories. At Newport News, workers erected massive gantry cranes capable of lifting entire ship sections. Separate construction areas built bow sections, stern sections, and the massive citadel that would house the boilers and turbines. When sections were complete, they were moved by rail and lowered into position by crane. Welders worked around the clock in 3 shifts. The concept was radical, building a ship the way Ford built cars. Traditional shipwrights were horrified. They said ships couldn't be built this way, that only time-tested methods of sequential construction could produce seaworthy vessels. But the Essex-class carriers proved them wrong. The ships weren't just built fast, they were built tough. Their armor protection included a 2.5-inch armored belt, 4-inch deck armor over magazines and machinery spaces. The citadel, the central core housing engines and boilers, was a fortress within the ship. The propulsion system showcased American engineering excellence. 4 boiler rooms, each with 2 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, burning at 850 degrees Fahrenheit. 2 engine rooms housing Westinghouse steam turbines, with combined high-pressure and low-pressure stages driving through double reduction gears. 150,000 horsepower total, top speed 33 knots, range of 20,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. These carriers could cross the Pacific, fight for weeks, and return home without refueling. But the most important innovation wasn't the armor or the engines, it was the flight deck design. Previous American carriers had flush hangar decks running the length of the ship. The Essex-class moved one of the aircraft elevators to the port deck edge. This seemingly small change revolutionized carrier operations. Now, aircraft could be simultaneously launched from the bow catapults, while others were brought up from the hangar. Recovery operations could happen on one part of the deck, while strike packages were being armed and fueled on another. The Combat Information Center, a new concept tested on the Essex-class, centralized radar displays and fighter direction. Multiple radar sets gave 360-degree coverage from sea level to 30,000 feet. 4-channel VHF radios allowed coordination between the carrier, its combat air patrol, and strike aircraft. For the first time, carrier groups could vector fighters to intercept incoming threats before they reached visual range. The anti-aircraft armament reflected hard lessons from early war battles. Initial Essex-class ships carried 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 32 40mm Bofors guns in quad mounts, and 46 20mm Oerlikon guns. As the kamikaze threat intensified, more guns were added until some carriers bristled with over 100 anti-aircraft weapons. The idea was to create a protective umbrella so dense that nothing could penetrate it. The human element completed the transformation. Each Essex-class carrier required a crew of 2,600 officers and enlisted men, plus an air group of approximately 1,800 more. That meant over 4,000 trained personnel for every carrier that slid down the ways. Training facilities expanded across the country. Norfolk, Pensacola, San Diego, and dozens of smaller stations churned out pilots, mechanics, radar operators, damage control specialists, and deck crews. The carriers themselves became floating universities. New crew members learned their jobs alongside veterans rotated back from the front. Every lesson purchased with blood in the Coral Sea, at Midway, and in the Solomon Islands was incorporated into training doctrine. Young pilots practiced carrier landings until they could trap on a pitching deck in darkness. Damage control teams drilled endlessly, learning to fight fires, seal compartments, and keep their ships fighting even when wounded. By mid-1943, the strategic situation in the Pacific had fundamentally shifted. Japan's Kido Butai, the elite carrier striking force that had devastated Pearl Harbor and terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, had been broken at Midway. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sank in a single day. The veterans who had honed their skills in China and perfected them at Pearl Harbor were gone, their experience irreplaceable. Meanwhile, American carriers were multiplying. The fast carrier task forces that Admiral Mark Mitcher and Admiral William Halsey commanded in late 1943 bore no resemblance to the desperate defensive operations of early 1942. Task Force 58 and Task Force 38 became hammer blows that fell wherever Japan was weakest. 3, 4, sometimes 6 Essex-class carriers operating together, screened by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, supported by fleet oilers that let them stay at sea for months. The raids began in earnest. The Gilbert Islands in November 1943. Tarawa's beaches ran red, but carrier air power from Essex, Bunker Hill, and Independence pounded Japanese positions into rubble. Then the Marshall Islands in January and February 1944. Kwajalein, Eniwetok, and the Japanese stronghold at Truk were hammered by waves of carrier aircraft. The Japanese called Truk the Gibraltar of the Pacific. American pilots called it target practice. The pace of operations would have been impossible with fewer carriers. When one needed replenishment or repairs, 2 more were already on station. When battle damage took a carrier out of the line, another sailed from Pearl Harbor to replace it within weeks. The production pipeline never stopped. In 1944 alone, 9 more Essex-class carriers joined the fleet. The crews developed a rhythm: wake before dawn, man battle stations, launch the first combat air patrol as the sun rose. Throughout the day, strikes cycled on and off the deck, fighters providing cover, dive bombers hitting airfields and installations, torpedo bombers going after ships. Recovery operations as dusk approached, the most dangerous time, when tired pilots with damaged aircraft tried to land on a blacked-out deck with minimal fuel. Between strikes, the organized chaos continued. Aviation ordnancemen wheeled bombs and torpedoes from the magazines. Aviation mechanics swarmed over aircraft, replacing engines, patching bullet holes, fixing hydraulics. Refueling crews pumped aviation gasoline from the ship's tanks, over 240,000 gallons carried in protected compartments throughout the hull. The carrier's own machine shops manufactured parts, repaired equipment, even rebuilt entire engine sections. In June 1944 came the decisive test. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese combined fleet, gambling everything on one last carrier battle, sent 450 aircraft against the American invasion force at Saipan. 15 Essex-class and light carriers were waiting. The new F-6F Hellcat fighters, designed specifically to counter the Japanese Zero, launched in waves. American radar picked up the Japanese strike packages 70 miles out. Fighter directors vectored Hellcats to intercept. The Japanese pilots, hastily trained replacements for the veterans lost at Midway and in the Solomon Islands, flew into a meat grinder. American fighters shot down 243 Japanese aircraft on the first day. The second day, another 65. American submarines sank 2 Japanese carriers. American carrier aircraft sank a third. The battle demonstrated the Essex-class operating doctrine in perfect execution. Combined air defense created an umbrella that nothing penetrated. Even aircraft that broke through the fighter screen faced the massed anti-aircraft fire of the entire task force. Japanese pilots who survived the fighters often didn't survive the flak, and when American strike aircraft found the Japanese carriers, they sank them with the overwhelming numbers that only a fleet of Essex-class ships could generate. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 4 months later, October 1944, Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. 4 separate engagements spread across the Philippine archipelago. The Japanese plan was brilliant in conception, using their remaining carriers as decoys to draw off Admiral Halsey's carriers while battleship forces crushed the American landing beaches. It almost worked. Halsey took the bait, racing north with every carrier to engage the Japanese decoy force. This left the invasion beaches protected by only escort carriers, small jeep carriers built on merchant hulls. When Japanese Admiral Kurita's center force, including the super battleship Yamato, emerged from San Bernardino Strait at dawn on October 25th, it should have been a massacre. Yamato alone displaced more than all the escort carriers combined and outgunned them by an order of magnitude. But the escort carrier crews, supported by destroyers and destroyer escorts that should never have engaged battleships, fought with ferocious courage. They launched aircraft armed with whatever was available, depth charges, machine guns, even empty planes making dummy runs to distract Japanese gunners. The small ships made smoke, launched torpedoes, and charged directly at battleships 4 times their size. They bought time. To the north, Halsey's carriers, including Essex, Lexington, Intrepid, and Franklin, caught the Japanese decoy carriers and annihilated them. 4 Japanese carriers sunk. Then, receiving word of the desperate battle to the south, strike aircraft from the Essex-class carriers raced back. They found Kurita's force and attacked. The super battleship Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, took torpedo after torpedo. Dive bombers cratered her decks. She listed, capsized, and sank, taking 1,200 men with her. Kurita, surrounded by overwhelming American air power and believing he faced Halsey's entire fleet rather than a handful of destroyers, turned back. The invasion beaches were saved, and the Essex-class carriers had demonstrated that the age of the battleship was over. Yamato, the most powerful battleship ever built, had accomplished nothing. The carriers that cost a fraction of her construction time and resources had dominated the entire battle. The victory came at a price. As 1944 turned to 1945, Japan introduced a new weapon born of desperation: kamikaze, divine wind. Pilots who would deliberately crash their bomb-laden aircraft into American ships. The tactic was horrifyingly effective. Conventional bombs could be shot down or might miss. Kamikazes, even if hit by anti-aircraft fire, often retained enough momentum to crash into their target. The Essex-class carriers faced the supreme test of their design. On March 19, 1945, USS Franklin was operating off the coast of Japan, launching strikes against airfields on the home islands. A single Japanese bomber, a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, evaded the combat air patrol in the pre-dawn darkness. It released 2 armor-piercing bombs from low altitude. Both bombs hit Franklin's flight deck. One penetrated to the hangar deck, where 31 fully fueled and armed aircraft were being prepared for launch. The explosion was catastrophic. Bombs cooked off. Aviation gasoline ignited. Rockets launched in random directions. Torpedoes exploded. 832 men died in the first 30 minutes. The entire hangar deck became an inferno. Captain Leslie Garis refused to abandon ship. Damage control parties fought through the flames. They jettisoned burning aircraft. They flooded magazines before they could explode. They sealed compartments, cutting off the fire's oxygen. Franklin listed 14 degrees. Her flight deck was a twisted wreck. Most ships would have sunk, but the Essex-class design, with its armoured citadel and compartmentalized construction, held together. Franklin's crew, those who survived, nursed her back to life. They jury-rigged repairs. They restored propulsion. Incredibly, she steamed 12,000 miles from the waters off Japan back to New York under her own power. She suffered the highest casualties of any American ship that wasn't sunk, but she survived. The Essex-class design had proven itself against the worst imaginable damage. 2 months later, May 11, 1945, USS Bunker Hill, Admiral Mitcher's flagship, was hit by 2 kamikazes in the span of 30 seconds. Both were Zeros carrying 500-pound bombs. The first crashed into the flight deck near the base of the island. The second hit moments later. The combined explosions killed 390 men and wounded 264. Fires raged across the flight deck. Gasoline vapor explosions tore through the ship. Again, the crew fought back. Again, the Essex-class design held. Bunker Hill's captain maintained control. Damage control parties, many working while seriously burned, contained the fires. The ship survived and returned to Bremerton for repairs under her own power. In the final year of the war, Essex-class carriers survived being hit by no fewer than 17 kamikazes. Franklin survived after being nearly destroyed. Bunker Hill survived twin strikes. Intrepid survived being hit 4 separate times. Not one Essex-class carrier was lost. The survival rate wasn't luck, it was engineering. The armoured citadel meant that even catastrophic topside damage couldn't sink the ship. The distributed propulsion system meant that damage to one engine room didn't cripple the entire vessel. The training meant that crews knew instinctively how to fight for their ships, and the numbers meant that even when a carrier was knocked out of action, 3 more were ready to take its place. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, 17 Essex-class carriers had seen combat. 7 more were commissioned too late for the war but served in Korea and Vietnam. The final construction total was 24 carriers completed, with 8 more cancelled when victory made them unnecessary. In 36 months of war, from December 1941 to August 1945, American shipyards had produced more fleet carriers than Japan had built in its entire history. The strategic implications were overwhelming. Japan had sent its 10 battleships, including Yamato and Musashi, expecting that quality would triumph over quantity. Instead, those battleships spent most of the war in port, starved for fuel, afraid to sortie, because American submarines controlled the sea lanes and American carriers controlled the air. When Yamato finally sortied in April 1945, it was on a one-way suicide mission to beach herself on Okinawa and fight as a stationary fortress. She never made it. American submarines detected her departure. Essex-class carriers launched nearly 400 aircraft. In 2 hours, Yamato absorbed at least 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs. She exploded and capsized, taking over 3,000 men to the bottom. The largest, most powerful battleship ever built had been sunk without ever firing her massive guns at an enemy warship. The mathematics that Japan had wagered against came due with brutal finality. Building Yamato had required 4 years and consumed resources equivalent to building 3 fleet carriers. Her construction tied up Japan's largest dry dock and most skilled workers. Her sister ship, Musashi, required similar investment. Together, these 2 battleships represented an enormous portion of Japan's limited industrial capacity. They fought in one major engagement, Leyte Gulf, where Musashi was sunk and Yamato accomplished nothing. Compare that to a single American shipyard. Newport News Shipbuilding produced 7 Essex-class carriers during the war. Each one carried an air group of 90 to 100 aircraft with a combat radius of over 300 miles. Each one could strike targets 600 miles away and return. The combined striking power of those 7 carriers exceeded everything Japan's entire combined fleet could generate. And Newport News was just one of 5 yards building Essex-class ships. The final accounting was stark. Japan began the war with 10 battleships and 6 fleet carriers. By August 1945, every battleship was either sunk or damaged beyond repair. Every carrier was at the bottom of the Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the 3rd most powerful in the world, had ceased to exist. The United States began the war with 3 carriers operational in the Pacific. It ended the war with 99 carriers of all types, including 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, the most numerous class of capital ship ever built by any nation. But the numbers alone don't capture the full story. The Essex-class represented a philosophical revolution in how America thought about war production. Traditional naval powers like Britain and Japan built individual masterpiece ships, each one unique, each one requiring years of craftsmanship. The Washington and London naval treaties had reinforced this thinking, limiting the number of ships each nation could build and pushing designers toward individual excellence. America, freed from treaty restrictions and blessed with industrial capacity beyond imagination, chose a different path. The Essex-class wasn't designed to be the best carrier. It was designed to be good enough to win, tough enough to survive, and simple enough to mass produce. Like Henry Kaiser's Liberty ships rolling off the ways every few days, or B-24 bombers coming off assembly lines at Willow Run, the Essex-class embodied American industrial philosophy. Quantity has a quality all its own. The yards that built them underwent their own transformation. At the start of the war, American shipbuilding was a traditional craft industry. By war's end, it had become a precision manufacturing operation. The standardized components that made rapid construction possible also meant that spare parts from one carrier fit any other. A damaged rudder could be replaced with a spare from storage. Radar systems were interchangeable. Even entire aircraft elevators could be swapped between ships. This interchangeability extended to the human element. Pilots trained on Essex could land on Lexington. Radar operators qualified on Intrepid could operate the systems on Bunker Hill. Engineering crews transferred between ships with minimal retraining. The entire class became a single, flexible weapons system rather than a collection of individual ships. When one carrier needed repairs, its air group could transfer to another within hours. The operational tempo this enabled was unprecedented. Traditional carrier operations required careful husbanding of resources. Ships needed rest, crews needed rotation, aircraft needed replacement. But with 24 Essex-class carriers in the pipeline, the fast carrier task forces never stopped. When one carrier air group was exhausted, it rotated back to Pearl Harbor while a fresh group took its place. When battle damage required repairs, the ship sailed to Puget Sound or Pearl, while another Essex-class filled the gap. Japanese commanders, accustomed to their own logistics constraints, couldn't comprehend what they were facing. After Midway, Japan took over a year to rebuild and train replacement air groups. After the Philippine Sea, they never recovered. Meanwhile, American carriers that took damage at the Philippine Sea were back in action for later Gulf, 4 months later, with fresh aircraft and fresh pilots. The grinding arithmetic of attrition warfare favored the side that could replace losses fastest. The experience shaped post-war American naval doctrine profoundly. When the Cold War began, the Navy knew exactly what kind of fleet it needed. More carriers, not bigger ones. Flexibility and numbers over individual capability. The Essex-class carriers, modernized with angled flight decks and steam catapults, served through Korea and Vietnam. The last one, USS Lexington, wasn't retired until 1991, nearly 50 years after she was commissioned. That longevity testified to the fundamental soundness of the design. Yes, technology advanced. Jets replaced propeller aircraft, nuclear power replaced steam turbines, but the basic concept remained valid. A mobile airfield capable of projecting power anywhere in the world, tough enough to absorb damage, numerous enough to be everywhere simultaneously. Every American supercarrier built since World War II traces its lineage back to that first Essex-class keel laid at Newport News in April 1941. The workers who built these ships came from everywhere. Women who'd never touched a welding torch became skilled craftsmen. Farm boys from Iowa operated massive overhead cranes. High school teachers read blueprints and aligned bulkheads to tolerances measured in 1/16 of an inch. Shipyard employment exploded from tens of thousands before the war to hundreds of thousands by 1943. Newport News alone employed over 30,000 workers at peak production. They worked around the clock, 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The night shift at Newport News became legendary for productivity, workers racing to beat the day shift's records. Friendly competition between yards drove innovation. When one yard found a faster way to install electrical systems or mount anti-aircraft guns, the technique spread to all the others within weeks. The same knowledge sharing that made Liberty ships faster made Essex-class carriers better. Safety remained paramount despite the pace. A workforce killed or injured in accidents couldn't build ships. Yards invested in protective equipment, training programs, and safety inspections. The pressure to deliver ships quickly never justified cutting corners on worker protection. It was enlightened self-interest. Healthy workers were productive workers, and America needed every hand. The communities around these shipyards transformed as dramatically as the yards themselves. Newport News grew from a modest Virginia town to a major city. Norfolk, already a Navy town, exploded in size. Brooklyn's Navy Yard became one of New York's largest employers. Philadelphia's Yard drew workers from across Pennsylvania. Housing, schools, hospitals, transportation, all had to expand to accommodate the influx. The mobilization for war touched every aspect of American society. For the sailors and aviators who served aboard these carriers, the experience created bonds that lasted lifetimes. Living and fighting aboard an Essex-class carrier meant being part of a community of 4,000 men isolated at sea for months. They ate together, slept in shifts, worked jobs that ranged from cooking meals to defusing unexploded bombs. When kamikazes struck, everyone fought the fires together, regardless of rank or specialty. Officers and enlisted men formed bucket brigades. Cooks became stretcher-bearers. The ship became home in a way that landlubbers could never quite understand. The Essex-class air groups became famous. Air Group 15, the fabled 15 that flew from Essex herself, included Commander David McCampbell, who became the Navy's top ace with 34 kills. Air Group 5 from Yorktown earned the nickname Bloody Five for its aggressive tactics. Air Group 2 from Hornet perfected night carrier operations, launching strikes in total darkness to catch Japanese forces by surprise. Each air group developed its own identity, its own tactics, its own legends. The aircraft they flew evolved as rapidly as the carriers themselves. Early Essex-class ships operated F-4F Wildcats, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. By war's end, they flew F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs, SB-2C Helldivers, and improved Avengers. Performance increased dramatically. The Hellcat could outclimb, outrun, and outdive the Zero. The Corsair was faster still. Combined with better tactics and radar direction, American carrier aircraft achieved kill ratios that approached 10-to-1 by the war's final year. Maintenance kept the aircraft flying. Every carrier had a maintenance organization that rivaled a small factory. Machine shops could manufacture replacement parts from raw stock. Aviation machinists rebuilt engines aboard ship. Electronics technicians repaired radios and radar sets with hand tools and vacuum tubes. The supply system kept parts flowing, but the ability to improvise, repair, and rebuild meant that even when supply chains faltered, the carriers kept fighting. The logistics behind this effort staggered the imagination. Each Essex-class carrier consumed thousands of gallons of fuel oil daily. The aircraft burned aviation gasoline at prodigious rates. Ammunition expenditure during combat operations was measured in tons per hour. Food for 4,000 men required refrigerated storage and careful planning. Freshwater distillation plants produced thousands of gallons daily. Every consumable item, from engine oil to toilet paper, had to be stocked and tracked. The fleet train made it possible. Oilers, ammunition ships, stores ships, and repair vessels formed a mobile supply base that followed the carriers wherever they went. Underway replenishment, perfected during the war, let carriers refuel and rearm without returning to port. A carrier could pull alongside an oiler, rig fuel lines, and pump thousands of barrels of fuel while steaming at 15 knots. Simultaneously, ammunition lighters would come alongside, transferring bombs and shells by crane. The entire process took hours instead of days. This mobile logistics system meant that fast carrier task forces could operate for months without touching land. They ranged across the Pacific, striking wherever commanders identified targets of opportunity. Japanese bases that had taken months to build were reduced to rubble in single days. Airfields were cratered beyond use, harbour facilities destroyed, ships caught at anchor were sunk. The carriers moved on before Japanese reinforcements could arrive, appearing next at a target hundreds of miles away. The psychological impact on Japan was devastating. Early in the war, Japanese citizens had celebrated victories. By 1945, American carriers operated within sight of the home islands with impunity. Japanese airfields, once considered safe, were destroyed by successive waves of carrier aircraft. Japanese citizens could see American planes overhead. The invulnerability that Japan had felt after its early victories evaporated completely. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, Essex-class carriers filled Tokyo Bay, rows of them, stretching to the horizon, floating proof of American industrial supremacy. The formal surrender ceremony took place aboard the battleship Missouri, a symbolic nod to traditional naval power. But everyone present knew the truth. The war had been won by the carriers. The battleships were there for show. The carriers had done the work. The lessons of the Pacific War reshaped global naval strategy for generations. Every major navy began building carriers. The British, the French, the Soviets, all recognized that carrier-based aviation was now the foundation of naval power. Battleships were relegated to shore bombardment and escort duty. The era of the battleship, which had dominated naval thinking for 50 years, ended not with a grand, decisive battle, but with a whimper as the age of the carrier began. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The Essex-class carriers, those 24 ships built in just 36 months, represented more than engineering excellence or industrial might. They represented a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Wars are won not just by heroes in battle, though courage matters, not just by brilliant strategy, though strategy matters. Wars are won by nations that can produce the tools of war faster than the enemy can destroy them. Wars are won in shipyards and factories as much as on battlefields. Japan sent 10 battleships, including the mightiest ever built. America built 24 carriers in the time Japan took to build 2 battleships. That was the real weapon, not the steel or the aircraft. The weapon was the productive capacity of a fully mobilized industrial democracy. The weapon was 30,000 workers at Newport News, producing a carrier every 14 months. The weapon was the ability to absorb losses, rebuild, and come back stronger. In the end, Yamato lies at the bottom of the East China Sea, her massive guns silent, her crew entombed in her hull. Essex-class carriers, several of them, rest at dock as museum ships, where visitors can walk their decks and imagine what it was like when these ships ruled the Pacific. The comparison tells its own story. Quality couldn't overcome quantity. The samurai sword, however perfect, couldn't defeat the assembly line. In total war between industrial nations, victory goes not to the side with the best individual weapons, but to the side that can produce good enough weapons in overwhelming numbers. 24 Essex-class carriers in 36 months. That was America's answer to Japan's 10 battleships, and it was an answer that echoed from the shipyards of Newport News to the waters off Okinawa to the surrender deck of the Missouri in Tokyo Bay. An answer written in steel, sealed with blood, and proven by victory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.